Concord by O.G. Gross. Successfully, Karl Marx identified the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the material dialectic, but despite his emphasis on creativity, he failed to identify the artifex, meaning creator class, which is made up of entrepreneurs, inventors, and artists. An artifexian, which is the term first introduced in this paper, is anyone who creates or recreates a means of production and/or a thing to be produced. Marx, it seems, conflated creators with the general proletariat. Consequently, his material dialectic only halfway addresses the nature of socioeconomic change. Section 1. Defining the material dialectic, Marx argued that capitalism was inherently contradictory, for it inevitably undergoes, of one kind or another, creative destruction. The businesses it produces destroys others, the resources it consumes leaves many lacking, and so on. For him, at the center of capitalism was self-destructive paradox. And though he was correct that creative destruction exists in capitalism, he was missing an essential component. Marx claimed that alienation drives the working class or proletariat to revolt against those who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie. He was correct, making revolution imminent. The question remaining is how the revolution will occur. For the proletariat to seize the means of production and thus become like the bourgeoisie they rebelled against is just as alienating and ironic as being forced to work on something that one doesn't own. Both kinds of alienation manifest in apathy, violence, and/or desire to be amused to death. A forceful and violent revolution, as Marx pointed to and Lenin advanced, rather than overcome alienation, causes alienation, which stimulated the revolution in the first place. Marxists and Leninists throughout history have revolted in the wrong way. They've continually chosen a French Revolution over a glorious one, per se. The concept of revolution for Marx was set in motion by his axiom of the material dialectic. Again, in this framework, since a revolution occurs within the dialectic that caused the tension, a successful revolution only makes the revolutionist the new bourgeoisie. This is no revolution, only a shifting of chess pieces, if you will. If means of production were not created, but simply were, then to seize them would be an act of revolution. However, all means of production are created, and it is this very act of creation that is truly revolutionary. To create is to revolt. The man who starts a business claims that he has a competitive advantage over other businesses and seizes the means of production by creating a new means of production. Through creativity, he claims that he is part of the bourgeoisie without their permission. In creating what he owns and what he works, he furthermore chooses how he needs others by choosing which enterprise to create that requires demand, and so escapes both the enslavement of the bourgeoisie's need for the proletariat and the proletariat's need for the bourgeoisie. He becomes both, an artifexian. He becomes free. In this regard, the woman who pickets big oil doesn't launch a revolution as effective as the woman who invents the alternative energy that obliterates its stock value. Entrepreneurship is peaceful revolution, creativity a nonviolent resistance. Note that an artifexian isn't someone who just thinks creatively, but who also realizes that creativity into being or enables others to formulate it. Unrealized creativity is nothingness. Also note that creativity is realized in structure. A society without structure is void, but a society whose structure includes organic activity and whose organic activity develops the society structure is a society that thrives. A purely artifexian society isn't one without customs, laws, or rules, but one in which the limits enable limitless development. As there is a conflict between owners and workers, those who own and operate the means of production are always in a conflict with those who create the means of production. Those who invent can render a system of production arbitrary, which is a threat to both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Keep in mind that those who own the means of production are not necessarily the ones who create the means of production or who make them possible. Owners are many, inventors few. Though Marx recognized the bourgeoisie and the proletariat caught in a tension, he failed to identify the tension between both them and creators. Yet, as the owner is in a way enslaved to his need for workers, so the creator is enslaved in requiring a functioning and effective society and system of production. The creative person who has no food does not have time to create, and even if he does, without a means of distribution, his creativity cannot be received. It is the system of production that sustains a means of distribution for creators, but without creators, those means of distribution wouldn't come into existence. The better and more stable the socioeconomic order, the more creativity can flourish. This is why technological advancements have grown rapidly over the last 100 years. Our reason, at least, society has become increasingly stable. A creator requires an environment, but a doesn't require others in the same way the bourgeoisie and proletariat require one another. The material dialectic fashions the environment that creativity occurs within, like a botanist preparing an environment for plant life, but the artifex ultimately transcends the dialectic by becoming that which feeds its material to construct its environment and itself, all while also teaching the dialectic how to do so. Though the master requires the slave in being a slave, the master, the creator, is his own master and servant. If there was no material dialectic, the artifex could create one, but the material dialectic couldn't create the artifex. The artifex creates itself, while the bourgeoisie and proletariat create one another. They are helpless without the artifex, but the artifex isn't helpless without them. If it needs them, it creates them. While the material dialectic forces people into the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, entrepreneurship and creativity offer a means for people to transcend the dialectic by becoming artifexians, owners and workers of their own makings. This transcendence is only possible in a free and creative capitalistic society, while a society that is merely free inevitably undergoes creative destruction. Section 2. Unlike the material dialectic, the creative chord is not inherently conflicted or neurotic. The bourgeoisie and proletariat can choose to collaborate with the artifex and vice versa. Thanks to the artifex, it is possible for the bourgeoisie and proletariat to likewise choose to collaborate with one another. The inherent tension of the material dialectic is thus eased. Through the artifex, the proletariat can transfer into the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie into the proletariat without conflict. Some members of the bourgeoisie are also members of the artifex, as some members of the proletariat are members of the artifex. It is possible for a member of the proletariat to become a member of the artifex, and in so doing, transfer into the bourgeoisie without alienation, as a member of the bourgeoisie can slip into the proletariat and escape upper class alienation. Described by Robert Cole, the artifex is both an overlapping and independent structure, and it can function as a transfer stage or as a class unto itself. By creating an enterprise, a person comes to own and work a good of his or her making. Unlike the bourgeoisie, who is alienated by not producing what they own, or the proletariat, who is alienated by not owning what they produce, the artifex is free. The citizens who travel within the material dialectic from the proletariat to the bourgeoisie, or vice versa, finding alienation in both conditions hopeless, is very likely to fall into depression, tragically rampant in the modern world. The artifex is both autonomous and freely collaborative, while the proletariat and bourgeoisie cannot have autonomy and are forced to work together due to the material dialectic, making true, unalienating collaboration impossible. Independence, freedom, and true community are only possible with the artifex, and the stronger it is, the stronger the individual and the society as a whole. The more the individual is able to help the other without alienating or being alienated, the more able the individual will be to find that working with others makes the most of oneself. As mentioned, unlike between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a person can be part of the artifex while also being part of the bourgeoisie and or proletariat. This is a significant difference from the material dialectic. In that schema, the owner of the means of production could not also be one of the proletariat, nor was the other way around possible. But in the creative concord, without conflict at all, a worker at a company can also be creating a new company on his laptop. Not inherently self-destructive in relating to one another, the artifex, bourgeoisie, and proletariat can choose to transcend the material dialectic into the creative concord by working in concert. Rather than simply a dialectical relationship, creators and the material dialectic can harmonize. Until, that is, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat turn against the artifex, or vice versa. Then the unity breaks down into a cacophony. Consequently, the creative concord devolves back into simply the material dialectic. It is only a matter of time, then, before the relationship between business owners and workers also collapses, just as Marx predicted. Clearly, the presence of the artifex is important for avoiding creative destruction by annulling the alienation caused by the means, management, and creation of production, while also offering a means for the proletariat and the bourgeoisie to shift or combine positions without psychological tension or violence. The artifex both sees problems and envisions possibilities, and either addresses them or enables others with technology, knowledge, or motivation to do so. Others may not see what can be addressed, or may address one thing and fail to realize anything else to do. Because the artifex sees what is to be done, and often does it, is the artifex and the creative concord which drives history in the Hegelian sense. This is because, with perfection always just ahead, there is always something to be done, which drives the artifex. If prevalent and influential, the artifex also shifts the focus from the distribution of limited resources to the creation of new ones, from the health of today's enterprises to the birth of tomorrow's. Rather than a model that is at the expense of some and advantage of others, the creative concord is inexorably to the benefit of all. It's only a matter of time. Again, without the artifacts, the bourgeoisie and proletariat must clash. Without creativity, the material dialectic is all there is, and stuck in creative destruction, it will devour itself. Marx, like Einstein and out of my later years, was correct to note that at the core of capitalism is a paradox that is both the source of its productivity and self-destruction. Capitalism is an economic system driven by a desire for profit that subsequently raises the standard of living through mechanisms of problem-solving and or possibility realization. But once those problems are solved or possibilities made real, unemployment increases. Without new problems or possibilities, the system stagnates. Even if the material dialectic continues to have old problems to keep solving and maintain low unemployment, without new possibilities or problems, the standard of living flatlines. With this lack of development comes a raising level of boredom, alienation, and tensions between paralyzed high and low classes. Creativity is both a source of employment and unemployment. It is a source of creative destruction, and as long as it is present, so shall creative destruction, and the material dialectic will not devour itself. At worst, to its benefit, it will lose itself in the creative concord. In a society where creativity is high, unemployment stimulates workers to be creative, and employment for those feeling alienated by it does the same. The jobs lost by creativity are made up by those created by it. If creativity was prevalent, when creativity caused an enterprise to close down and unemployment to go up, creativity would then set its eyes on solving that problem. Unfortunately, in a society lacking creativity, unemployment and employment both cause alienation from which workers find no alleviation readily. These workers will want to revolt, but without creativity, they will revolt in a deconstructive manner, and their personal lives will suffer. In a creatively illiterate nation, the creativity that causes jobs to be lost will be out of balance with job creation, and those who lose their jobs will find themselves helpless, unable to transition into the artifex. Consequently, the less creativity there is, the more creation feels like a sin. If a nation vibrant with creativity, the unemployment caused by the artifacts would gradually force all members of the society to advance into the artifacts, eventually causing the society to transcend alienation and the material dialectic. This makes society like communism, but rather than obliterate class structure into a universal class, as Marx called it, it makes all people both classes. While the bourgeoisie and proletariat exist in conflict by definition, and the creative concord, the artifacts eventually absorbs them into a harmonious family. The artifacts also forces the owners of the means of exchange to invest more in variable capital than constant capital, addressing the concerns Marx raised in his theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. While the bourgeoisie tended to invest in itself to maintain power, ironically stifling profit, the artifacts forces it to invest in innovation and exploration by creating goods that put the value of the means of production that the bourgeoisie owns at risk. In other words, the artifacts forces the bourgeoisie to grow the artifacts. For this reason, if the artifacts is large, it tends to become larger. However, if the artifacts is small, as will be explained, it tends to become smaller. It is the proletariat, either for creativity or against it, which tends to decide the directionality of the artifacts' development. Ironically, it is possible that the bourgeoisie will influence the proletariat against the artifacts, but the proletariat can revolt against this manipulation by becoming creative and joining the artifacts. A wise bourgeoisie will balance investing resources in the proletariat and the artifacts, causing a gradual and sustainable rise in both the standard of living and rate of employment until the society is unified in the artifacts. Section 3. Creativity both creates and solves unemployment and drives up the standard of living through the technological achievements or entrepreneurships it invents to solve the problems which previous technological achievements or successful entrepreneurships may have caused. A society high in freedom and creativity, then, is inherently self-motivated. A self-motivated person is the opposite of an alienated individual and is only possible in a both free and creative society. Depression is practically guaranteed in a nation that is free and wealthy but not creative, while a nation that lacks freedom fails to foster creativity. Leisure without vision could be as alienating as work without ownership. The value of capitalism is determined by the degree it enables creativity, which is tied to a sustained productivity and prosperity. The system is self-destructive, as Marx admonished, without it. To the degree capitalism is successful, then, is to the degree it enables and educates a strong creative class. The stronger the artifacts, the stronger the economy, and happy the people. Once creativity is gone, since the material dialectic must undergo creative destruction by definition, freedom must eventually also be lost. There is no liberty where there is no economy. The weaker the economy becomes, the more liberty decreases. This is because there cannot be liberty where the individuals do not have the economic capabilities to rise above their circumstances. Though economic freedom is not the only freedom, it is a necessary part of a free society that is lost when the material dialectic implodes. The other freedoms tend to follow. Great nations fall once freedom is gone, and the reason they give up freedom, rarely if ever realizing it, is by devaluing creativity. Left to the material dialectic, without creativity, a society becomes reliant on growth through repairing damaged goods, distributing limited resources, credit creation, and or living off the fruit of past generations, none of which are sustainable. While living on the past fruit, it is very tempting to stop emphasizing creativity, for there seems to be no pressing need for it until things turn fatal. If the present is good, it's hard to think about the future or to care about the past. Ironically, creativity is what makes possible this entitlement mentality, the making of the broken window fallacy, and so on, via the increase in the standard of living which creativity causes. In this sense, creativity is risky. The less creative a society, the more threatening creativity becomes, as shares of a company become more threatening and yet more vital to one's livelihood, the more money the individual has stored up in that one basket. Take how Google is both viewed as a great blessing and a monopolistic threat. Yet regardless of how threatening it may be, a society has to tap into that creativity, for economic growth is driven by it. Knowing they are enslaved to this source, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat can become increasingly uneasy with the artifex, while alienation gradually setting in. This tension eventually leads to violent or unjust forms of rebellion against the artifacts when business owners, for example, recognize they aren't creative enough to adopt to creative innovation, such as the internet, and when the proletariat consequently recognizes their jobs are at risk. As an increasing reduction in the availability and abundance of the means of production accelerates the self-destruction of the material dialectic, so a reduction of creativity accelerates the shrinking of the artifacts. This being the case, once creativity begins to fade in a society, it is probable that it will continue to do so. With that eventually goes freedom, and for this reason, though the present may be good, it is clear that America is in a dire situation. Risk management is the practice of diversifying risk in order to reduce losses and increase profit. The more creativity there is across a society, as influenced by the school system and family structure, the more that society has invested wisely and diversified the risk of creativity. Yet the more creative a society becomes, the more it risks high unemployment if that creativity ever screeches to a halt or slows down, due to regulation, a drop of abstract thinking, or so on. Creativity always entails risk, and risk is always necessary for value creation. Creativity is a double-edged sword, but a nation will only be cut by it if it freely chooses to stop paying attention. In the self-destructive material dialectic, regardless of what one chooses, an individual inevitably ends up slain. If America is to recover, it must take the risk and reform its education system and society to incubate creativity. Otherwise, it will lose its freedom. It will end up slain. Section 4. Capitalism is driven by innovation that increases the standard of living, yet those innovations make jobs obsolete, increasing unemployment. An innovation solves a problem, yet once that problem is solved, further creativity is needed to address the problem of unemployment caused by that innovation. An innovation both creates and destroys jobs. The question is, does it do more of the former or the latter? The material dialectic keeps problems involving material goods solved while failing to address mental and personal problems. On the other hand, the creative Concord solves and or finds problems in the first place, while simultaneously liberating participants from alienation. Yet all classes need one another. If cars stopped being produced after Ford died, no one would be able to invent a new car that ran on alternative energy. Rather, people would keep reinventing Ford's original model. Though this may keep employment high, it would not raise the standard of living beyond what Ford already raised it. Without creativity, the artifex disappears. Once that occurs, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat must clash and undergo creative destruction, for the material dialectic must work itself toward disappearing. This disappearance occurs fully, perhaps, during a draft, collapse, revolution, or in socialism. In socialism, though, there is a new dialectic between the owner, worker, and the government. Though the problem Marx identified as change formed, it has not been solved. Like the material dialectic, this totalitarian dialectic must also undergo a kind of creative destruction in which those who are forced into being both the owner of his or her labor and the laborer, feeling alienated by the government which forces them into this role, rebel against the governing class. The people do this to seize back the power to make an artifex class by choosing to be artifexian, rather than by force into a similar but alienating non- or universal class. Though this society must be creative, lacking freedom, compensation, motivation, and/or resources, this society cannot will to be creative or maintain creativity, lacking a material dialectic to work in concert with, causing the artifacts to vanish. Socialism fruitlessly tries to make citizens free by eliminating the classes of worker and owner rather than enabling each to be a worker-owner. There is no true unemployment, so neither is there true employment. Duty and altruism replace both. Consequently, neither employment nor unemployment can drive creativity and innovation, and though no jobs are lost by creativity, none are created by it either. Unemployment must be high, but the standard of living will be low. In socialism, bringing about a police state, the people rebel because there is no artifacts that can create itself, but the same can occur in capitalism. Once creativity dries up, so goes the artifacts, and with that, the material dialectic self-destructs. Though socialism inherently destroys the artifacts by annulling freedom, the artifacts' existence is possible, but not necessarily present in capitalism. Capitalism does not inherently work, but it does have the potential to avoid creative destruction by maintaining a healthy and strong artifacts. Unfortunately, the present American school system stifles creativity, as attested to by Ken Robinson, and more creative people are pressured by society, and most creative people are pressured by society to enter the real world of numerical chutes and corporate ladders. Self-destructively, this kind of peer pressure is a manifestation of the tension between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat against the artifacts. As the proletariat is most likely to start the conflict between it and the bourgeoisie is most likely to start the conflict between it and the artifacts, though the bourgeoisie will only be successful if it can influence the proletariat to join in. Yet, unlike the proletariat, the bourgeoisie is not as likely to turn to violence and revolution to stop the artifacts if creative individuals turn down their offers to be bought out or to sell their patents. The bourgeoisie is too comfortable, and though they may lose their businesses, they won't lose their lives. In this regard, it is more likely that the material dialectic breaks down than the creative concord, though the creative concord is more difficult to achieve. Also, citizens can choose to keep the creative concord strong by choosing to join the artifacts, while the material dialectic collapses inherently. All are alienated in the material dialectic, but in the creative concord, which comes into being by the choices of people, creative freedom can be exercised. It is important to emphasize that the creative concord collapses when the artifacts class vanishes, shrinks too much, or is greatly disabled, while the material dialectic breaks down because it is itself. The artifacts class doesn't have to collapse, but without it, the material dialectic must fall apart. It lacks a center. Therefore, the choice to give up the artifacts is the choice to give up freedom in the society. With creativity goes everything. Section 5. To be in a socioeconomic order is to be in the material dialectic. To be in a society is to be in a position for revolution. To create is to revolt. To start a business is to create a thing to produce and a means by which to produce it. Revolution is always imminent. Marx was right. Schools decide if revolution is bloody or glorious. An analytical school system that stifles creativity in a capitalist society is a strange and fatal paradox. Capitalism is failing today because the artifacts is small and inhibited by regulation and guilt. Those who invent 3D printers put the lives of millions at risk who will be unemployed as a result of their genius. Realizing this potentially puts creators through an existential crisis when they should be receiving praise and gratitude. In our current socioeconomic order, once unemployed and robbed of creativity, a person is helpless. Enabled by school to be creative, upon losing their job, people would simply create new means of employment. In a creative society, unemployment stimulates technological advancement because those who are unemployed are forced to create a new way for themselves. Unemployment results in numerous entrepreneurial startups, and saying that small business drives the market, creativity would make unemployment healthy for the economy rather than terminal. By becoming an artifexian, each unemployed worker would stage a revolution and transcend alienation, social stigma, and the material dialectic. Sadly, by glossing over unpredictable, unmanageable, and organic creativity, schools have taught Americans how to revolt violently and try to avoid the subject of revolution altogether. The entrepreneur revolution saves the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the society as a whole. The artifacts enable social mobility, actual wealth creation, and a higher standard of living in economic, psychological, and personal terms. Making it easier to focus on the next project, artifexians don't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Rather, they invent boots without straps. This has been The Creative Concord by O.G. Rose. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in more works, please visit www.ogrose.com. And thank you for your time.